Shalom and welcome back to another episode of Two Jews, 10 Opinions. I'm Ailee Shanes.
And I'm Levi Diamato.
And we are so excited to welcome you back to our third episode of this semester. And Levi, we have a special guest. Would you like to introduce him?
Yes. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to introduce our guest for today, who's Dr. Alex Lowie. Alex or Alexander?
Whatever you want.
Alex. And he is currently just finished his anthropology PhD, and now he's working at the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. And we really have him in here. First of all, thank you for coming in today.
Thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And we really want to talk about the research that you did over the course of your anthropology studies. You published this right here that's called The Way of the Warrior, an ethnography of the contemporary alt-right and patriot movement in Florida. This was pretty much the basis of your study over your PhD, would you say?
Yeah, for sure. And it's, I would say, published to ProQuest, which is essentially the open access for all dissertations and theses. It hasn't yet been published as a book manuscript or as articles or anything like that, but it is on ProQuest. We'll get into it. It's not on ProQuest yet, but we can talk about that later.
Right, yeah. Like you're going to publish it eventually?
Yeah, the intention for it, and I think everyone who's in my position right now, I am a postdoctoral associate at the Hamilton Center, which essentially means that I get extra time to figure myself out, which is really nice. And one of the things that I'm doing with that is I'm trying to take the manuscript that you've looked over, and I'm trying to cut out articles from it. I'm trying to take what's left over and publish it as a book manuscript. So if I want to be a professor at a university and get tenure, you have to publish. So it would be essentially taking my dissertation work and turning it into a book.
Got you. Okay. Well, so I've read chapters 4, 5, and 6 of this, and we can get into that more specifically. But I guess first to start off, just wanted to know how did you get interested in studying this, and where did you get the idea from, basically?
How candid do you want me to be? Like, how honest?
Honestly, as honest as you want to be.
Very honest.
So I'll start off by saying that I've always been really interested in politics. I've always been really interested in the intersection of politics and culture. And I've always been really interested in social movements and the way that they influence politics and culture as well. I promise you those three things are different. And when I wanted to go to grad school, you have to essentially send a research proposal. So I don't know if you guys have applied to a PhD program, but for anyone who's listening who hasn't, at least for my program, I had to pretty much write I think it was 2-page, single-space proposal. Having never stepped foot in a graduate classroom or done any pilot study or anything of any kind, I had to do the best that I could to develop a research plan, a study plan, a proposal, and then pitch why that works. And so I had actually, it was my third cycle when I finally got into a couple different programs. And I tell everybody that you pretty much have to learn how to do a PhD application. It's a learning process in itself. And then it's knowledge that you'll never use again for yourself. So you can use it for other people, but I'm never going to be applying for a PhD program again, at least I hope not. And so because of that, I don't ever actually have to do that again. But one of the things that you learn is, I would say, how to write a good statement. And so initially, I kind of had different ideas, and I think that's why it took me until my third cycle. And I eventually said, and this is a big thing when you start applying for grants for research and when you become a professional student, is there's always the question of where's the gap in the literature, or what are people not studying right now? And at the time, it was 2019, which was right before COVID. I actually applied in 2018, so it would have been the end of 2018 when I submitted all of that. And I was really interested in the Proud Boys. And I guess we can get into who those guys are later for anyone who doesn't know. But besides that, I was interested in them, and I realized that I really thought that there was a project there that I could do as an anthropologist. Because if you look at the literature, quote unquote, on them in particular, there's really not anything. And so there's a lot of the people who are talking about them are in journalism and the news. And no offense to everyone in the great J school where we're sitting, but from my perspective, there was a lot that was getting missed. And we can get into why I thought that and what I ended up finding in comparison. So you kind of craft that into your research proposal, and that's the thing that gets you into your PhD program, is actually what your intended study is. And all of that being said, my less eloquent answer is I really wanted to get in, and I thought people would be interested in that. So it was not only did I have interest in it, not only was there a passion there, but also
you're saying like you wanted to because of the gap in the literature, because there wasn't so much on it?
Yeah, there certainly wasn't a lot on it, and also I thought that a PhD program would be interested in having me, because maybe this is not a great opinion of mine, but as a graduate student, it certainly, in a PhD program, it certainly begins to feel like the department wants to brag about you to make themselves look really good. Mm-hmm. And I'm just out of my PhD program, so maybe I'll have a different perspective in a few years, but having just finished it, you kind of get to the end and you really get that feeling, you know what I mean? And so I had that intuition that is kind of what they already wanted anyways. So I thought, what can I do that will make someone interested and make someone want to let me go to their school, and then essentially give me money to do that? Mm-hmm. And so that was another reason as well. Yeah.
Well, what specifically about the Proud Boys, what was that interest and what kind of drew that interest? I mean, you applied to grad school 2018, 2019. Mm-hmm. That's during the Trump era presidency, but that was still before January 6th, where I feel like that's where it really kind of took off, and where talks about QAnon really started going crazy online, and other alt-right movements. So what was it about Proud Boys specifically, and what was it specifically about those alt-right conservative movements that really I really want to learn more about that. I'm really interested about that.
So first, I want to applaud your use of alt-right, because I think it's very easy for people who aren't in it. I think the terminology, we just are like, oh, catch-all, it can be anything. Mm. But for the people that are in it, the terms really, really matter. And alt-right, I think, is a very good term to use to refer to these people, specifically because it is, in their eyes, an alternative to the mainstream right. So an alternative to mainstream conservatism and an alternative to the Republican Party. I was interested because I grew up quite conservative, honestly. And I have a blue-collar upbringing. No one in my family went to college. None of my grandparents graduated high school. And so when it came to, when you're young and you're a teenager and you're trying to be politically active, that was definitely where I felt the most calling. That's definitely where my parents were. And so obviously I was taking a lot after them. And so when I was in high school, I did a lot politically. And then after high school, I did a lot politically as well with different candidates and stuff like that. And I was sitting there and I was thinking in 2016, here's this group I identify with, and I actually no longer really know if I identify with them because of Trump. And because of that, it really felt like the Republican Party was having this big split. And I think a lot of it was happening culturally. And the Democratic Party, I would say, under the leadership of Barack Obama, really, really united under one flag very quickly and very strongly. And the Republican Party floundered for 8 years under Barack Obama. I think just a complete and total failure on the national level, at least. The state level, I think they had a lot of successes. But that being said, I just looked around, and Florida has definitely swung in one direction as far as politics go, since we used to be a swing state. But I looked around and I thought, I don't really know if I'm here anymore. I don't really know if I'm with these people anymore. And so I would say my initial interest with the Proud Boys specifically came from my thoughts of, are these really the people that I want to identify myself with? Not as, me being a Proud Boy, but if they are calling themselves the right, and I'm calling myself the right, and Trump's calling himself the right, and QAnon's calling himself the right, what's going on here, and do I really want to do that anymore? Lo and behold, I don't call myself anything anymore, but I think that was not because of the research. I think that was already going to happen.
So how would you say your attitude toward these groups was before looking into them, before really wanting to delve into them?
I really appreciate that question. A lot of it, I think, was, I would say, informed by the media, and I would also say the internet. So the founder of the Proud Boys is a guy named Gavin McInnes, and he was actually really popular on a YouTube channel called Rebel Media. So if you're familiar with these names, Lauren Southern also used to be a contributor to Rebel Media and a couple other people. They're not really around anymore, but they were a Canadian media company. I don't know what you'd call it, media conglomerate, something like that. And they were really doing, especially because Canada, I would say, is left of the United States, they were really doing things that were certainly not within the realm of acceptability in Canada. And they were kind of attracted to the United States because of that. And so I was actually an undergrad, and I found out about Rebel Media, and I looked into them, and I realized that they weren't really like a leader in the movement or anything like that, but I really think they were indicative of where those things were heading. And I think it's 100% headed there since. And so that's kind of where I found out about Gavin. And then I would say that's where I found out about what he was doing specifically, which was founding the Proud Boys in 2016.
You know, it's kind of funny because I don't feel like we meet a lot of Jewish individuals like yourself, because I think, especially for a lot of the people on our podcast that we've brought in, especially last time in our last episode with Lindsay, it's more of we're kind of more left leaning, right? Mm-hmm. And then ever since kind of October 7th, even a little bit before that, we see what the left is kind of turning to, or who is part of the left, and we're like, oh, we don't really want to be part of that. What there's kind of this split now, right? Mm. And so you're kind of coming in from the perspective from the right, which I think is super interesting. Do you think your Jewish identity had any impact on this kind of, you know, you're seeing what the Proud Boys are talking about, you see what QAnon's talking about, and you say to yourself, hey, I don't know if I'm really part of this quote-unquote right anymore?
I would just completely candidly, I'm incredibly secular. I was raised incredibly secular. No one in my family at all is any religious whatsoever. My family was the type that came over through Ellis Island and ditched everything, essentially. And the only thing they didn't ditch was the Hungarian that they spoke. My grandmother refused to learn it, though, because she was not a big fan of her grandmother, so she wanted to protest to be able to never speak to her directly. So as far as that goes, I would say none, honestly. Yeah. So a lot of it really did come from what I believe I end up finding with my research, which is really, really heavily based in class, I would say. And we can get into definitions of class. I think the United States has a very warped perception of a class system, because I definitely do not believe that we are 18th or 19th century Britain or France. And that's where a lot of those class terms came from in Germany. And because of that, I think everyone here has a different idea of what it is. But as far as I would say sociocultural class comes from, I think that's where a lot of my viewpoints came from.
Mm-hmm. So, did you want to say something?
No. You can ask for it.
No, so I kind of want to see, did you want to kind of get into the research now, or do you have anything else?
No, I think it would be cool to talk about the class and kind of the ideas, like the way that you kind of wanted to tackle researching the Proud Boys. But I just was kind of curious, like, how does it work before, when you're leading up into doing this? What research are you doing? Like, what are you reading, and like from what time periods are you reading stuff from? Like, how late does it go back with your research?
Honestly, it can go back pretty late. And I think that any sort of preliminary research that you're going to do for a social science study, it's one of those things where you realize it's an unconquerable frontier. You're never going to read everything. And then you go to conferences and you talk to people and you give a presentation and they go, oh, well, if you haven't read this thing yet, well, you can't even really be talking about this. And you're like, dude, I've read a million things. I don't know what else you need me to read to have some sort of idea of what I'm talking about here.
Yeah.
And so I would say you end up realizing that you only have so much time. And because of that, your reading choices become necessity and they become utility. And so you end up reading the things that you have to read to be able to say the thing you want to say, or to think through the thing that you want to think. That being said, I would say honestly the furthest it goes back would be, we're talking dates. It wasn't published then, but it deals with, there's a book by a guy named Norbert Elias. I believe that's his name. It's called The Civilizing Process. And it's about the way that upper classes in monarchical courts would civilize, quote unquote, their subjects. And civilizing doesn't mean, making them all drink tea, but it means having them reflect a certain idea of a national or a ethnic identity. And so it was like, we're France and those guys over there are Germany. What makes us French? And it's the people at the top who are making that decision.
Yeah.
And then it's about them kind of saying, well, this is what makes us different from those guys. And I mean, that particular book, it's an old one, but it goes back, I think it goes back to like the 1200s or 1300s. So if you're looking at that time period in Europe, that would be a really good place to start. I also believe that, and this is a very long process to figure this out as well. I also believe that a lot of the people that I study in the quote unquote patriot movement have a perception of Christianity and Abrahamic religions. And I know for a fact that my biggest flaw was that I was not as well versed in any of those as I should have been, not to have some of the conversations that I had, but to have some of the understandings that I had about these people. That being said, definitely the fascist movements in the 20th century, late 19th century, those are very, very important. The idea of nationalism, what nationalism is, what it means, which really, again, kind of dates back to that, I wouldn't say 1300. It would probably date back to the 1500s. Everyone kind of points to the Treaty of Westphalia. Go ahead and fact check me on what year that was. I don't remember.
17 something.
No, it's before that. It's before that. That was the Treaty of Westphalia is pointed at as the establishment of a legal and formal ethno-state.
Yeah.
And so if you really want to get into the weeds there, when did we first establish the concept of an ethno-state, which then means when did we really first start to establish the concept of a national identity based in ethnicity on a certain plot of land, speaking a particular language. Another really good book that I think a lot of people should read if you want to have an understanding here. It's a seminal work. It's a guy named Benedict Anderson. It's by a guy named Benedict Anderson, and it's a book called Imagined Communities. And he talks a lot in there about the construction of a national identity. He talks about North America, South America, parts of Southeast Asia. But one of the biggest takeaways from that research, for me at least, is the idea that a national community has to be based in a shared language, or it's a lot easier if it's based in a shared language. And one thing that was really good for the standardization of language was actually the printing press, which would have been the 1400s, 1300s, right? And so an example that he gives is that in Italy, because of how hard it was to travel, every region had its own pretty unique dialect. And I believe the printing presses popped off in Tuscany, but I could be wrong, whatever area it was. And the Tuscan dialect actually became the standard Italian dialect because it ended up being the one that everybody read. And so it's taking little facts like that and understanding how national processes really start to begin. And they're really small like that. But then they turn into these really big things.
Gotcha. Were you going to ask the next question?
No, I mean, I don't have any.
Well, let's get right into it.
Well, I'd say too,
yeah.
Another really big book that is completely worth your time, if you're just talking about research, there's a million that are worth your time that I had to read for all this. But one that I would say is worth anybody's time, especially, I hate saying especially now, but for the people that I would say cry the loudest about things that they say are going on today, it hasn't been debunked, but it's been debated a lot. Hannah Arendt has a book called The Origins.
Origins of Totalitarianism.
Yeah, we've talked about it on this podcast
Okay,
before.
have you guys read it?
I have.
You've read the whole thing?
I have, yeah.
I started reading it, but my dad's like, you're not going to be able to know what
I feel like I learned so much from that book, and I feel like I maybe only understood like 50% of the book.
Well, that's good. You get to go back to it.
Yeah, I do own a copy.
Good.
But anyway, go on with what you were going to say.
No, I would just say that you ask about research. There's people like Hannah Arendt. I'd say a historian named George Mossey. He's a social historian. Everyone should pick up a George Mossey book at some point and read it. He was probably the biggest influence for me on my understanding of fascism because he defines fascism as a socio-cultural movement and not a political one, which I think is really important to understand. So again, those are some examples that I would say, and also I would say reading the people you're working on read, if that makes any sense.
That's another thing because what I was about to say was like you're reading all these academic sources, you're reading these documents from the 1200s, but then as we're going to get into, at the end of the day, you're just having a bunch of beers with these guys. So you need to read that stuff too. You need to be on YouTube. You need to be on. So how do you get into, like, how do you find those 4chan? I don't know if, I think 4chan is something.
Yeah, thankfully I didn't stay too long on 4chan, which is nice.
Sounds good, yeah.
How do you get into that? It's really not that hard, honestly. Yeah. The biggest thing I would say is just all the news outlets complain about the right-wing Nazi rabbit hole. I guess just jumping down that neck first. That's definitely not what I did, but I'm sure someone would phrase it that way. But it's finding, let's just say like Gavin McInnes, finding him and listen to the things that he mentions or references. And then you start following the citations. You start, okay, he references this book. I need to go read that book. Okay, in this book, they reference this other thing. I need to go look at that. And you just keep kind of going as far as you can with that. And I think it yields a lot of productive fruit, I would say.
I mean, we talked a lot about kind of your background on your research and everything like that. If you were to tell someone in layman's terms, someone who has never had any thought about the research that you have done, and just you wanted to kind of give like a summary about what your research is and what you've done, what would you say to that person?
So, as an anthropologist, I unfortunately I have to start there because I still have to tell people in my family what anthropology is.
Yeah.
Anthropology is the study of humans. At the University of Florida, we have a quote-unquote 4-field school, which essentially means that you can take classes in linguistics, biological anthropology, archaeology, and cultural anthropology. When I was an undergraduate here, I started and I was very intent on being an archaeologist. The first archaeology class you take, everyone has a very similar story across the nation of someone walking in dressed like Indiana Jones, unironically.
Yeah.
That's not it, Chief. That's just 100% not what archaeology is. If you cared, the real term for Indiana Jones is an antiquarian, but that's whatever. That's just, I'm just splitting hairs. And I really wanted to do archaeology completely transparent. Field school for archaeology is super expensive, and I couldn't afford it.
Yeah.
And so I started looking into what else the discipline had to offer, and cultural anthropology was really interesting. And I took a class called Ethnographic Methods, and I didn't really know what ethnography was. I had read a few, but I still didn't really understand what it was. And the idea of an ethnography traditionally for an anthropologist is the story that you can picture in your head where I'm really interested in this tribe in the middle of Papua New Guinea. I'm going to learn their language. I'm going to take an airplane, to take a smaller airplane, to take a boat, to take a smaller boat up a river, and I'm going to go live with this tribe for a year, and I'm going to write down about them, and I'm going to write the book on these people. And surprisingly, the world is pretty global nowadays, and that doesn't really happen anymore. Mm-hmm. I mean, even those tribes are pretty global people nowadays. Yeah. A lot of them have cell phones. I think most of Africa has a cell phone at this point and has for like 10 years. And I think by most, I mean an overwhelming majority. So you get this idea in your head when you're a young student in the discipline where, I'm going to go off and I can't wait to learn, Bantu or something. And you realize that the world's actually a lot smaller than you thought it was. It's not 1930 anymore. It's actually 100 years after that. And so when I was an undergraduate, I took that ethnographic methods class. And I was really, really attracted to quote-unquote urban anthropology. I would say it blurs the line with sociology, but the questions that are asked are different and the way that you ask them are different. So we can still call ourselves anthropologists. And I realized that there were a lot of people, even in the United States, that I don't think we knew a lot about or we really understood that well from a national context or national perspective. And so knowing that I couldn't hike into Africa and find a tribe to live with, I tried to find something else to do. And as an undergraduate, I did my senior thesis actually on my hometown. I'm from Sanford, Florida, where the Trayvon Martin shooting occurred in 2012. And I had this dream to do a project on the way that the shooting affected the community. And so I was trying to not at all talk about the shooting itself. And I was instead trying to talk about the impact that a major social event like that had on a place at a particular time. And I took that idea to the history department and I said, I got this great idea. civil rights is the rage right now. Let me in. And the history department, have you ever seen Fresh Prince of Bel-Air?
Yeah.
You know when Uncle Phil throws out Will's best friend through the front door?
Mm-hmm.
That's what they did to me.
Oh
they just threw me out the front door. They're like, no, dude, no, you can't do that project here.
Why?
They said it was too contemporary. And at the time, I was like, that was 5 years ago. It's not contemporary. And they're like, it's contemporary. And so I kind of was bummed by that. And I just so stupidly happened to have a meeting with the anthropology undergrad coordinator at the time. And I told him I was going to double major, and he signed my papers, and he said, were you planning on doing a senior thesis? And I said, I had, but the history department doesn't want me to do it. And he said, what is it? And I told him, and he said, let's do it. And he had never met me before until that day, hooked me up with a cultural person to oversee it, and then I immediately got to do a senior project on that specifically. And so with that sort of ethnography, there are a couple of research methods. Interviews are really big. So I interviewed a lot of people from the community and just asked them their perception of the community before and after the shooting. Did you think Sanford was a particularly racist place before the shooting? Do you think it is now? What's your perception on the media and how they treat a place like Sanford? Stuff like that. And then another research method is probably everybody's favorite, which is, or at least, I don't know. Yeah, maybe. It's called participant observation. And so when you walk into that tribe in Africa and they start putting on their masks and dancing, you put on a mask and you dance with them. And you, by virtue of doing that, you get to become one of them in a very particular way. And so, unfortunately, well, thankfully, a lot of the stuff that had happened to the community was kind of in the rearview mirror. So a lot of it was sort of the participant observation of my own experiences that were kind of referenced there.
Yeah.
And so later on, when I do my research with the Proud Boys, there does have to be a level of quote unquote participant observation. And so, I would say that's where I got with that. So what do I do now? I wanted to ask the question of who are these people? What do they believe in? Why do they believe in what they believe in? And what do they want? And by these people, I'm referring, I would say broadly, to what I refer to as the Patriot movement. Again, that is how they define themselves. And so by my use of that term, I don't want people to think that I'm seceding the word patriot. Ceding? Whatever the word I'm trying to use. I'm not trying to give them the word patriot. But that's how they refer to themselves. So I'm the type of person who is very, very willing to give up some semantic argument so we can just move on.
Yeah.
And so for me,
thank you.
I'm like, oh, they call them all right. This person calls them Nazis. They call themselves the Patriot movement. Fine, you're the Patriot movement. What does the Patriot movement have to say for itself? And that was sort of what I wanted to do with my research, is get an understanding of them. And the thing that makes it really hard, I would say, is that when you get an understanding of someone, I would say in an ethnographic sense, there's good in there too. And you find things where it's very hard to do research on someone you hate. Let's just say that. So, and especially if you come at a research project like this from a place of hate, I think you're just going to fall flat on your face. And so, you kind of have to let yourself live in their world. And I mean, I don't want to say it's scary, but it's definitely not the world that you live in. And so you have to be comfortable with understanding that you're going to be a little uncomfortable every now and then. And that's kind of what I had to do. Yeah. And then to take it a step further, my specialty in ethnography is this concept of narrative ethnography, where I'm focusing on their narratives and the stories that they have to tell. And then by virtue of that, I'm writing my ethnography in a way that is more story-driven. So it's very qualitative and not very quantitative. And boy, do some people hate that, which is cool with me.
I'm curious about, because our podcast is 2 Jews, 10 Opinions. What did you find specifically with the Proud Boys and their attitudes towards Jews and towards, specifically in America, Jews in America, but just Judaism in general? What have you found about that, with your research?
So to answer that, I'll give a little bit of context. One of the things that I did for my research is you have to use what's called a chief informant. I don't even know if, in a year, that's not even going to be the politically correct term anymore. So whatever the term is at this point, you find someone who's already in it, and you say, hey, hold my hand and walk me through this. And there's actually this really cool concept in anthropology where you are a child and you have to become an adult. And so it's like you're literally holding someone's hand walking into a situation, and you're seeing as a child would see because you don't know what's going on. So I had a chief informant, and he knew some people who were in the Proud Boys. And it just kind of spiraled from there in a good way, where he vouches for me so I can meet somebody. That guy vouches for me so I can meet somebody, and so forth. And eventually I ended up meeting what I would call the local Proud Boys chapter president, definitely local to where we are now. And that sounds weird and feels weird to say, but there is one. They're less than an hour away. I know exactly where they are, or not exactly, but I know where they hang out, or at least in some places I have hung out with them. And the chapter president specifically that I ended up talking to, he definitely informed me that he was raised by Jewish people. He was adopted, but he was raised. He has nothing against Jews. And I said, okay, that's cool. And then when October 7th happened, they all made it very clear that, quote, oh, bro, we're on your side. And
right. But for what reasons, though?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For what reason? So, I mean, they say, we're on your side, and I'm like, what side am I on? I'm like, I haven't talked to you guys about this.
I never like that in general. If someone comes up to me and they're like, I'm on your side.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And like I kind of said earlier, like I try not to think of myself in sides, just because individually I don't like to feel like I'm pigeonholing myself or limiting myself, because I think when you start to tie up beliefs with identity in that way, it's very hard to change your mind. Because you realize that those beliefs like become a part of yourself. This is totally not the October 7th thing, but I'm just saying in general. And I don't know. I don't like to do that to myself for the most part. So he said, we're on your side. I'm like, what side? He's like, oh, Israel. I'm like, okay, cool. And you
don't like to really have your opinions be. Well, I don't know how early this was into you meeting this person, but like
a few months.
Oh, okay. But still, do you keep your opinions kind of reserved? Like you like to do more listening then?
I mean, listening's the best tool for my job. And so he said that, and I said, okay, cool, I guess you're cool with the right of Israel to defend itself or self-determination, whatever the reason is. Your question about why is a great question. And I think the only answer to that could come from speculation, so I'm not going to speculate on that.
Yeah.
And because, I mean, again, it's their beliefs, so I'm not going to speculate on why they have their beliefs. Of course, that might be my job. Anyways, so there was that. But then I would say later on, I don't know if it was later on in the relationship or later on in that particular conversation, they do reveal to me the use of some Nazi imagery in their clothing and their merch. And I just, I kind of say like, what's up with that? Why are you using that? And at first they give me an answer of, well, we're just, this had a use before the Nazis. One in particular didn't. Again, I'm not going to sit there and fight him about it. It was the Sonnenrad, which is the black sun. From what I know, from what I've seen, it really doesn't have like a true basis in some historical Nordic ruins or something. It really is just the Nazi symbol that they made up. And then there was a couple other things like the Totenkopf, which is the skull and crossbones symbol that I believe the SS wore, and a few other things besides that. And I don't want to say I interrogated him on this point, but I just kept saying, what do you mean you're taking it back? I said, from who? Why do you need to take it back? And then, then the argument became, well, we're not going to let what other people say define us. If we want to use these symbols, we will. And it's really hard. I'm not going to sit there and say that the use of those symbols is an outright example of anti-Semitism, but they are using Nazi symbols and they know what they are. So I would just say, and also when I say using them, they are using them on private channels. And I also want to make the huge caveat that one of the tentpoles of the research and the arguments that I make is that they are very, very obsessed with what, as an anthropologist, I would just call like the idea of play and humor. And so piggybacking off the idea of play and humor, there's this other concept of the social lens of stigmatization. And one thing that I write about is this concept of self-stigmatization. And so socially, this idea of a stigmatization obviously comes from the root of like the stigmata. So with Jesus Christ, he has the bloody palms from getting crucified. And the idea of that being put onto someone is that socially, the stigmata comes with a set of ideas and concepts about who that person is. And so when you put a stigma on someone, it already creates the language and the relationship that you're going to have with a person. So before I ever meet you, I walk up and I see your necklace and I say, okay, I know what this guy's about. I'm on your side, brother. You know what I mean? Like, you know, but so like in a way, not any negative connotation, but in a way, your necklace is a stigma.
Yeah.
Because you
but
are. But
also in a way, I wore this today.
It's a self-stigma.
Right.
Isn't that crazy?
And just for our audiences back listening, Levi's wearing a Star of David necklace just to give some imagery to the
exactly
visual component.
So, with that being said, you know, and you have every right to wear this necklace, but you know that when you walk on campus, there might be some people that see your necklace and treat you totally different in the wrong way because of that.
Yeah.
And giving that same concept, there is this idea of, I would say, self-stigma with these guys, with these people. And part of that comes from this idea of humor, where they just think it's funny. And humor is subjective, so if you think that's funny too, okay. And the other part comes from this feeling of anti-authoritarianism or anti-establishmentarianism. I think I said that word right. And so if the establishment doesn't like that I'm using these symbols, I'm going to use them simply to annoy them and nothing more. There's no other reason.
It's basically like the elementary school. Like if you tell me not to do something, I'm going to do it more.
I'm going to troll you because it's funny and because you don't like it. And that does sound childish and that does sound immature. But if you hold this worldview and opinion that a lot of these people do, I mean, what else is there to quote unquote resist the dominant power structure? You know what I mean? I mean, in 2020, we saw a lot of social protest, and we saw what that did. And in a certain way, things were productive. In another certain way, things were not productive at all. And so, you know, I'm not in the business of saying whether or not a form of social protest is productive. But I would certainly make the argument that to some of these people, the use of those symbols is or could at least be for social protest or to troll. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and is trolling always just to be anarchic and funny, or, you know, are there some trolls that have a purpose and actually do something? Again, it's not for me to say that. That's just the point I'm making. Yeah.
Yes,
No, I just think that.
What I was gonna. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you go. No, I don't have anything right now.
What I was gonna say also was piggybacking off of the whole anti-Semitism thing. When you're talking, I think we talked in person about this, and also maybe you mentioned it in the writing about, like, they do have these conspiracy theories, I think, that are often historically tied in with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. But, like, when you press them on it, it's not, like, like, for instance, like the New World Order thing. Like, right? Like, they're into that,
not all Jewish,
right?
to them.
Yeah, but it's not Jewish thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just making that.
Well, so let me say it's not at all. It's definitely rooted in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. It's definitely rooted in the Protocols of Elders of Zion. It's definitely rooted in all those things. But some of the people there really don't know that connection and really don't make that connection. There are certainly some there that know the connection and make it. Maybe some do it just because they think it's funny. Maybe some do it because they really believe it. But there are a lot of things that they believe that are conspiracies or something like that that are rooted in anti-Semitism. And it's one of those things where if I don't know what they know, I don't know what's in their heart, but there's a very good chance that some of these people don't realize that the things that they're saying, the jokes they're making, are rooted in something else, and therefore it's hard to pin it to them, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, though, because I think you see that same thing on, you know, I guess you could kind of call it alt-left as well. I mean, and what we're seeing today, I mean, people are saying slogans like "From the River to the Sea" or "Globalize the Intifada," and they don't really know where that's rooted in. But it is rooted in anti-Semitism. It's, you know, "From the River to the Sea" is just calling for, you know, the destruction of the state of Israel, which in turn will get rid of, you know, Jews in the Middle East. So I think it's very similar in the fact that they're not. I guess they don't know that it's anti-Semitic, or they don't know, I guess, like the roots of it, but the roots are anti-Semitic. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's hard to be someone in the know, quote unquote, and think that everybody else is in the know. Because you have to remember that you are your own person and there's only so many hours in the day to know things.
Yeah.
And so when you hear people talk about, oh, dog whistles or whatever, it's sort of like, well, A, you heard it. Does that make you a dog? That's a joke I make. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to know what context people know. And so with my job, and honestly, I don't want to say it's gotten me in trouble, but people have certainly frowned on some of this stuff where I think a lot of people, when they hear about the work that I do, just want like a total condemnation or a total, oh no, they're actually totally fine. And I don't give either of those things because it's totally, I would say just like from a research perspective, that's totally unethical to do anything like that. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I'm not going to sit there and say someone knew something and they were doing that to be mean. But I can say that, hey, this person said this thing. I don't know what they know or not. They didn't give me any more evidence one way or the other. But this thing does have a root somewhere. And so it's, it's just hard to know whether or not they know the roots.
I'm really curious. It kind of, I guess, going on like a different topic here, but how did you kind of, I mean, you kind of discussed it about how you kind of got you kind of got an in, then that person got you an in, but even so, like, how did you get them to say these certain things to you? Because I feel like if they know kind of where it's going and where this information is going to be publicized, at least for me, if I was in that situation, I probably wouldn't say anything. So how did you kind of get them to be honest with you?
So for the type of research that I do, I had to complete an IRB review, which IRB stands for Institutional Review Board. Particularly for mine, it's an IRB 2, which is social research. Just so you know, this is the same office that handles prescription trials, drug trials, and I had to go through the same office. The University of Florida is particularly strict about IRBs because I believe it was in the 70s. I could be wrong. Again, if I am, cool. We lost our R1 status. We actually lost the ability, I think, for like a week to conduct any sort of research from the U.S. government because we were not compliant in particular things. If you ever wonder why our zoology program here isn't very good, but Santa Fe State College down the road has a zoo, it might have to do with that. Look into that if you're interested. Or at least that's what I've heard.
I haven't thought of this before.
I have a few friends who are primatologists that have told me stories. And because of that, the University of Florida never wants to go through that again, and they're very strict with their IRB, which is great. I definitely believe that as a social scientist, there could be a conversation to be had about whether or not the type of research that I did should qualify for an IRB review. Regardless, I still had to do one. And so one of the major tenets of my process that they had to approve. So I essentially had to have a caseworker look over a proposal. They made a bunch of changes. Then I had to put it in front of a whole board to get approval. The board meets once a month. This was also during COVID times, and so it was over Zoom. And there were some organizational snafus that were not my fault that I would say delayed the IRB approval process. And when you meet with the board, some of them are medical doctors, some of them are social researchers, others are lawyers to make sure that the paperwork is written the right way, or at least that's what I was told. And you realize that it's a little bit bigger than anthropology, and the university does not want to be found at fault for anything. And they want to make sure that you're maintaining ethical practices and procedures. You have to take a lot of IRB training. Honestly, I recommend that you two do it. It's free. You can go ahead and find it on the UF trainings. It's interesting. I would just throw that out there. If you want to think about developing research plans, I think it's a good idea, especially with people. And as journalists, I think you guys could benefit from it. But one of the big case studies is the Nuremberg trials, whether or not people can consent to that sort of research. Same would go with asking ethical questions about whether or not prison populations can consent to any sort of research.
You mean researching people in the defendants of the Nuremberg trials is what you mean?
No, like what the the Nazi doctors did
Oh,
to
okay,
the
okay.
people. Yeah, I'm sorry for not being clear about that.
No, you're good.
Yeah, so for what the experiments they ran on people,
Yeah.
whether or not those were ethical. I think we have a pretty good idea of whether or not they
Not
were.
ethical.
Yeah, not at all. But that's used as an example of why we would want to do an IRB. And so one of the things that I ended up doing is getting a lot of approval from them. So you have to get scripts approved. If someone has a mental health crisis, you have to have the resources already listed to help them, which I had to provide to the IRB. And let's just say everything in between. Anything you can think of, you have to do that. And so that being said, all of my research was completely transparent. Every single person that I spoke to knew my full name. They knew where I worked. They knew what I was doing. They knew what I was going to do with it. And so I would say understanding that and understanding the trust that they gave me, I think does put a huge burden on a researcher to be as honest to their experience as possible. So I don't want to say to get it right, because I'm positive that there's probably a few things I got wrong, because I'm an imperfect observer, because I am a human being. That being said, I tried to recount the conversations and the experiences that I had as accurately as I could. Levi, I hope I did a good job from what you read of not editorializing the things that I saw and heard. I didn't try to give my opinion to those things. I didn't try to fact check. Actually, like if they said something about the election being stolen in 2020, I'm not going to sit there and argue with somebody, and I'm not going to. It's not even really worth the time in my own writing to say, actually, according to, it
Not
wasn't
worth it at
stolen.
all, yeah.
And also, doesn't that seem combative to these people anyway? And I don't know, just in general, how rude of me to sit there and they let me in and then me just eviscerate them afterwards, or, in the middle of it. So I have not done anything like that. So yeah, everything that comes out in the research is they all knew what they're doing. They all completely knew what they're doing. They also, I think this is interesting, and hopefully people find this interesting. They all use call signs. So especially post January 6th, everybody has a made-up name, an identifier. And so in my research, I anonymize names, but I anonymize call signs. And there were only, of all the people I met, I think I only know one of their real names. Actually, three. I know three people's real names. And I have a part in there that I think Levi read about picking my own call sign and kind of what that means. And I think that's a really interesting idea of getting to recreate yourself in this community. And so even on the places where it was appropriate to give my call sign, everybody knew that I was Alex. So at the very minimum, I can at least say I was honest the entire time. Mm-hmm. Yes, that was because, well, it wasn't because of the school. I was going to be honest anyways. I wouldn't lie to these people. I wouldn't lie to anybody. But yeah,
I think that's very true. Just from reading, from what I've read so far, I think that's definitely, and I think it also that gets you way more information. Yeah. Like you get so much more information once you're in and you have these connections.
Exactly, and I would say the things that come out in my writing that are revealed, those were revealed not under some sort of bad understanding. They all knew who I was and what I was doing. So if they didn't want to share anything with me, I'm positive there were things that they concealed. They should have.
Yeah.
So I got a glimpse at the things that they knew could be shared.
You got a better glimpse than a lot of people. I don't know how much time we have, by the way.
I'm good for however long you guys want.
Oh, okay.
I mean, we've been going for like about an hour.
Okay, so we'll go soon. I have a lot of questions on the book, including like just kind of a random question, but I think it's early. I think it's in chapter 4, and you have this meeting. I think it's with the Proud Boys, not maybe the 3 Percenters.
It's the 3 Percenters.
Right, with they have all these factoids like the Westminster Massacre. What was the other one? The Orion River Company. Did you look up what any of these? Because I looked up a few of these things, and a few of them I knew. I didn't write down the ones that I knew, but some of them are just random events. So kind of talk about like also their view of world history. I mean, U.S. history. Yes, that's a big part how they view U.S. history. Yeah.
So you're referring to, funny enough, their website.
Right.
I just find it. I find it really funny that we have these anti-government organizations and they have websites. I don't know why, but that's just like hiding. That's just like hilarious to me. And that I will tell you, I know firsthand that those are great recruitment tools. And I'm not saying that these are the same things, but there's a book written by a lady named Catherine Bellew. It's called Bring the War Home. I do think you guys should read it. It's very good.
I feel like I've heard of it before.
I might have mentioned it to you before.
Maybe.
And essentially, she tracks the history of the paramilitary movement in the United States after Vietnam, which is closely tied to the white supremacist movement. I'm not saying these are the same things. But in the white supremacist movement, paramilitary movement, post-Vietnam, when the internet started to be introduced, it turned into a huge recruitment tool. Mm-hmm. And so for anti-establishment, anti-government organizations, the internet is and probably always will be a huge recruiting tool. Because the way that I kind of explain it is when let's just say you're in your own town, you're in your own city, maybe there's one or two people that hold these beliefs, and they start telling their friends I have these beliefs, and their friends don't agree with them. Socially, maybe you're going to correct your beliefs or your behavior and say, oh, well, my friends don't believe this. I might not believe this anymore. But now we have the internet, and you can have any idea you want and express it, and then other people can say, oh, I've had that idea too. So then instead you get, your one or two people per city, and eventually that turns into a huge population of people. And when other people start seeing that people have those ideas, they go, oh, well, it's socially acceptable to have this idea in the social system that I'm a part of. Maybe I can believe that. Yeah. If that makes any sense. Yeah. So their websites are honestly hilarious. It's funny that they have a website to me. The Proud Boys had one, and they got rid of it in 2020.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Wonder what happened.
Oh, I know exactly what happened. The debate between Trump and Biden, not the one that ended Biden's career, but the one that was good for Biden, when he mentioned the Proud Boys, and Trump said, I don't know who they are, but stand by and stand back or something.
Right.
Like that.
Yeah.
I was told firsthand by multiple people that crashed their website because there were that many people that wanted to join, and it was a significant amount of people. But then they realized very quickly that a good portion, I don't think even a majority, but a good portion of those people had bad intentions. So they closed the website completely, and now the only way to join is if you know somebody.
And there's also the interest in making it local level, but that's not something we need to get into. Well, what I wanted to really ask was like, what's the if you could say one big thing that people, I guess, who think of these movements don't understand, or I guess get wrong or just overlook about them based on your research?
So we mentioned class. I think class has a lot to do with it. That being said, I think that in this movement itself, there is I don't want to call it rigid, but there is certainly a hierarchy. I do think that to some degree it is class-based. The reason that I'm saying that is because more of the people in leadership roles that I met were better off financially. A lot more of the people that were lower or maybe socially had a lot of capital but didn't have a lot of responsibility were the opposite. That being said, what would you say was the big thing I found in Chapter 4? Like the most surprising thing that you got from my trip to the homestead?
When you had the gun aimed at you?
Well, that happened, but the other thing.
I don't know. The whole chapter, you're talking about the one at the compound.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. What would you say is like the most significant thing I found?
In terms of the class structures, you mean with the kind of indentured, the servants, I guess you would call them, right? Yeah.
So the word that I would use or phrase would be debt bondage.
Right. Yeah. That's what you use.
Essentially, what it is someone either has a large debt already, or someone wants to make a large purchase. Perhaps they're an immigrant, they want to get to the United States, and there's someone who's willing to transport them to the United States and house them. Or in this instance, there were people who already had large debts, and there was someone who had a little bit of money who was willing to help them pay it off. And in return, that person could live on their farm and help work the farm. And that is, given that term, a very reasonable situation. When you understand, I would say, past just that sentence, that there turns into, there's a dynamic that gets created between the leader of the group and the person who becomes indebted to them. The term that I think is probably most appropriate would be debt bondage, which essentially means that there are maybe pressures that would be put on the person in debt that they would not otherwise face from the person that they are indebted to. And so in that structure, there's a huge class difference, honestly. And I'm not saying that these people who are leading are, white collar criminals or anything like that. A lot of them are very blue collar. They just have been very successful and they've done very well for themselves. And they really believe these things. Or they find an organization where they have a sense of security, a sense of power, and a sense of belonging. And they use their standing to help with those things. Additionally, a big takeaway that I found that would kind of help people understand these people is, and I get a lot into it, I think, in chapter 5, the conspiracy or the religiousness of conspiracy. And so when you start getting something like QAnon, I know you mentioned QAnon earlier, it becomes this overarching worldview that everything's included and that there are powers at play behind the scenes that are pulling the strings that we can't see, that don't have our best intention, but there are some that do. And then you start realizing that this political movement almost is a moral movement because, for example, with January 6th, they truly believed that the election was stolen. Why was the election stolen? Well, there's this thing called the deep state. Well, there's this thing called the New World Order, where there's this thing called the WHO and the World Trade Organization, and they all don't have America's best interests at heart. And everything that they do that is bad for America is bad for the people. So then it becomes moral, and you're not only standing up to this government entity, but you're or para-government entity, because the World Trade Organization isn't a government, but you start to realize that it's religious. And so I would say it's really easy to get steeped in these ideas when you understand them in terms of religion. It's easy to understand why one would lead to the other. Mm-hmm. Just like if you think about a system of logic or a system of morality that is based on a religion, it's very easy to get from point A to point B on some things, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does a lot of that, jumping from one thing to another.
Yeah.
Reaching, I guess you would call it.
I mean, I wouldn't even really call it reaching. I would just say
connecting the dots, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. It's all connected.
Right.
And it all has to do with this big fight between good and evil. And that's what makes it so religious, is that it is at its heart a battle between good and evil and nothing less, which is why people get so passionate, which is why someone like Ashley Babbitt was willing to die for it.
Right. Yeah.
Which is why then she becomes a martyr for the movement, which is also a religious thing. So I would say, again, I'm not saying that the conspiracies are unfounded or bunk or anything like that. I'm just saying, and I'm not saying that they're not or that they're not, but I'm just saying that they are thought of in terms of religion.
Yeah.
Like in the same framework in your brain. And most of these people are Christian, or at least identify to be that way. So I'm not saying that that's their religion, but I'm saying that the way that it is thought of and believed is very similar.
It's like a religion, pretty much, is what you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, it turns into one. And I would say, the battle of good and evil is certainly rooted in an Abrahamic belief system.
Yeah.
And I think, Levi, I read the QAnon Shaman's book.
Yeah.
First half, honestly, really wasn't that crazy. I was kind of like, yeah, man, I kind of think the government's doing that too. And then the second half, it gets into interdimensional angels that are trying to molest children. And you're like, oh, okay, you're really crazy. Okay. I see where we're going with this. And that's when you realize that he really does believe that angels exist and demons exist and that they are doing good and bad things on behalf of the government.
Yeah.
I mean, that is an actual thing that is, at least that's what I got from it with the quotes.
Yeah. It was it was what I expected, though, to be fair, personally.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes there are
from a man of his caliber.
Sometimes there are no surprises. Yeah.
I think my last question would be, what's something that you would like to learn more about these types of movements? What is next for your research when it comes to this?
Yeah. Like, if there could be another component to the research project, what would it be?
The alt-left.
Okay.
Yeah, which I think is what the research that we need right now.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking a lot about like horseshoe theory and
Yeah.
like the way that these things combine, and there's stuff like that all the time that I read when you're talking about these groups, especially with like how they bizarrely they support Putin.
Yeah,
like
they're rooting for Putin.
Yeah, they're rooting
Their
for
words,
Putin.
yeah.
Stuff like that.
So I would say, just from an academic perspective, where I lie with these things, I think horseshoe theory is a good way to conceptualize what is going on. I don't particularly know if it's an effective way to actually comprehend what is going on. So if you're trying to visualize it, I think it's great. But I do believe that the reason why something like the alt-right is such a mystery to everybody and why everybody gets it so wrong is because we really, really are on this left-right dichotomy. And in Chapter 3, there's a lot of conversations that I have with one of the members of the Proud Boys where you realize that they have the exact same beliefs about BLM on some things, like identical. And you sit there and you go, whoa, you guys are supposed to hate each other. And they've even told me, they're like, oh, I don't hate BLM. I actually have a conversation with one of them. I don't remember if it made the cut. My original manuscript was 120,000 words, and the one that I submitted was 99. So I cut a bit.
Yeah.
I cut a quarter of it. And one of the things, a little under a quarter, and one of the things that they say is, oh, I could totally understand why someone would hate white people. And this was like a white guy telling me that. I'm like, all right, interesting. Tell me how. And he explained. And on one hand, I mean, you can get into this idea of what someone says and what someone does and how they're different and which one you're supposed to believe, which one's the truth. Don't ask that question to an anthropologist. We don't need to get into it. But when you start looking at things that way, you realize that there's a lot of overlap. Yeah, there's a lot of overlap with things. And so, yeah, I would say the alt-left, quite frankly, I don't know what the work that I've done. I don't know if they would even be as open to speaking with me. And another thing that I would say that would make the alt-left challenging is that I feel like the alt-right, the extreme right, whatever word you want to use for them, alt was the one that I applauded earlier, so I'll say it. They are just now understanding the idea of what I refer to as cell style of organization, of social organization, which is essentially the idea of we don't have a national hierarchy. Why would you not want to have a national hierarchy?
Well, do you want to answer?
I think Levi already knows the answer, so what do you think?
Why would you not want to have a national hierarchy?
Yeah, so why wouldn't the Proud Boys want to have a national board?
I mean, my guess is so that it's more, I guess, secretive, maybe, and that maybe that it doesn't become that, I guess, cause for concern among, like, the U.S. government, maybe. That's just my guess on it.
You're getting close.
Yeah, you got to it.
Yeah.
I think.
Pre 2018, there was a national board. They had a national chapter who oversaw all the other ones and regulated it. They actually, it's very interesting. You can't find it anymore online. They had a list of bylaws. Like they had like an actual, this is how you remember. And they got rid of it. And it's to avoid being prosecuted by the federal government as a gang. So a lot of the paramilitary movements post-Vietnam are cell style. And I would say a lot of the alt-right has realized that that is the way to go if you do not want to get in big trouble with Uncle Sam. And I would say a lot of the alt-left has a different origin, and they were already hip to the idea of cell-style organization. Which is why in 2020, when we had all the riots, protests, movements, whatever you want to call them across the country, and people kept referring to Antifa, there is no Antifa.
Right.
We
this
don't
was
have
the whole point of contention. This was a big thing.
And again, with the I'm willing to concede some linguistic ground there, and that's actually something I talk about with, which is Antifa with a big A or Antifa with a little a.
Yeah.
The 3%ers, which is one of the groups that I speak to, they are not a national group. They do not have bylaws. They are a set of beliefs. Antifa, I would say, is very similar.
Yeah.
And the people that pointed the gun at me and the people who had the people in debt bondage who were also present at January 6th are cell-styled organized. That doesn't mean that they don't talk to each other. That doesn't mean that they don't have a social network that says that when you go on vacation, here are the bars to go to where people are cool to you, because they definitely have those things, I've been told.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that they don't go and do training with other groups from other states, because they do. But they do not have a national hierarchy, because if one of them goes down, they do not all go down.
It's so interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that was interesting when I learned that.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap up, right? Yeah?
Yeah, I got a meeting with Molly Segi in 15 minutes.
Oh, dude.
Shout out Molly Segi.
A previous guest of the podcast.
Shout out Molly. Thanks, Molly.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on today.
thank
I
you.
feel like
Welcome.
we could have gone for another 45 minutes, me personally. But what can we expect? When will this be? You were talking about publishing before.
Ooh, that's a...
We can't. Can we publish this? When? Like,
Oh, you're talking about...
No. Like your writing. Like
my writing?
Yeah.
I'm actively working on converting chapter 3. I said chapter 2 earlier when I talked to the guy, or chapter 3 earlier. It was chapter 2. I'm actively converting chapter 3 into an article.
Cool.
It fit for a dissertation. It probably does not fit for a book. Besides that, academic publishing is a wild, wild west, and nobody knows what they're doing, and nobody knows how long it should take. So if I'm being incredibly optimistic, the manuscript that Levi has read will probably not see publication as a book for at least another 2 years.
All right.
It literally takes that long.
And what can we share with our audience so that they can kind of get a better understanding of your research? You said that you have something on ProQuest that we could possibly that is publicly available.
You can view the thing on ProQuest in 2 years.
In 2 years.
Because I was advised to keep it for safety reasons for 2 years.
Yeah.
Where can you find me? Oh, okay. I mentioned this to Levi.
Yeah.
My master's research was a photoethnographic project. We don't need to get into what that means. Just connect the dots there. And I did research on my grandfather's archive. He was a pilot in the Vietnam War from 1964 to 1965. He only served one tour and then said never again, and then became an abusive alcoholic for the rest of his life. And so while he was over there, he kept a diary and he wrote my grandmother letters, and she kept all of the letters. And so I am currently doing a project called Dearest, Suzie, where every time that a letter was dated a particular date, I am posting a recording of myself reading that letter and then giving background either about my family or about history, or about the military, or I'm doing like a response piece that I wrote in addition to it. And that is being posted starting October 1st, so definitely after this drops. But you should be able to find it wherever you listen to podcasts. It's called Dearest Suzie. So that's Suzie. So that's what I'm working on right now. But that's sort of just a side thing. So I guess if you want to contact me, you can do that there. I guess that would work.
Yeah, we'll put that in the link.
Yeah, for sure. And is there any because I'm sure you might have some kind of page with the University of Florida we could link to, just so people could understand your research, just if they wanted to go to like a profile or something.
The Hamilton Center website, I can give you guys the link.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right now I'm a postdoctoral associate.
Well, we will watch your career with great interest.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Did you get that reference or no? Oh, it's from Star Wars. No one knows the... Never mind. Do you know Star Wars, right?
Yeah, I know Star Wars.
Yeah, you know in Phantom Menace when like the young Anakin is walking and then like the Chancellor Palpatine is like...
You picked the one nobody watches.
Anyway, all right.
We've all watched, but nobody wants to remember that we watched.
Thank you guys so much for listening to another episode. Hope you enjoyed. And
thank you guys so much. Have a great holiday season. I know Rosh Hashanah is right around the corner, so if you're celebrating, have fun, enjoy. And again, Alex, thanks again for joining us. We really appreciate it.